Hi everyone, this is the pre-reading video for April 21st, for the assignment that's due on April 21st. So for that assignment, you're supposed to read some pages, pages 152 to 167 in the Norton Introduction to Literature. Again, those are I just have scans of those books as we've had all semester. This assignment actually comes in two parts. So I've got 152 to I think 161 in one document, and then 162 to 167 in another. And so the first document just tells you some stuff about character, and the second one has the story, the lesson. And so I want to talk us through the first part of the lesson before you read the story called the lesson. I want to talk you through the first paragraph and to think about how you can pick up a lot of information from the sentences here that may not seem obvious at first. We talked about this some already when we were looking at I'm a mad dog biting myself for sympathy. But I want to look at it here as well, because this is maybe a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder to pick up some of the information from than I'm a mad dog biting myself for sympathy, but it still can be done. So let's go through and look at the first paragraph or so here. So it starts off, back in the days when everyone was old and stupid or young and foolish, and me and Sugar were the only ones just right. This lady moved on our block with nappy hair and proper speech and no makeup. So one of the things just to keep in mind is we should be learning a lot about her just from these sentences, and you should be starting to pick up this information. Realize that nobody is going to tell us this is how old she is, or this is where she lives, or this is her race or anything like that. We aren't going to find, nobody's going to necessarily tell us that information directly. And so we have to pick up some things. And so she's going to say, when everyone was old and stupid or young and foolish. And so somehow, and me and Sugar were the only ones just right. So you get this sense that she thinks of herself as being in between these people who are old and young. Okay, so that could mean a lot of things, but at least we get this sense that somewhere she sees herself in between those two. So we just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the story when we're trying to figure out maybe how old she is. Later on in this sentence, she talks about this lady moved on our block with nappy hair and proper speech. And just think of that word nappy hair. That is a term that's usually used by African Americans to talk about hair that isn't necessarily very controlled. And so right from this, right here in this first sentence, if we're picking up on that word nappy, we're understanding, oh, she's probably African American. And then she's going to be talking about and proper speech. And so we might talk about the fact that within the people that she's used to hanging around with, they may not use proper speech all the time. They may use more of a slang at certain times. And so this proper speech is going to be something a little strange to her. So already realize from the first sentence, we're starting to pick up some basic background information about how we're supposed to think about her. So let's go to the next sentence. And quite naturally we laughed at her. Laughed the way we did at the junk man who went about his business like he was some big-time president and his sorry-ass horse his secretary. And one of the things here has to do with the time in which this story takes place. The junk man is a person who would come around to people's houses, go up and down the streets, and collect junk from people that would be recycled. We don't have junk men that much anymore. We do have people who do collect recycling and sell it back. All those aluminum cans get turned into things like airplanes. And so, but at the time when this story takes place, we're looking at like the 1950s or 1960s. You would have people who would actually come around and collect old pots and pans and other kinds of junk that would get turned into other things. That metal would get recycled. And again, we don't recycle things in that same way anymore, but that was a way that that would get done. So this tells us something about the time period that that would happen. And notice that he says he would go about his business like he was some big time president. He's just the junk man, but he acts like he's the president. And his sorry ass horse is secretary. This is at a time when people, even in the 50s and 60s, this story, by the way, I'm going to give it away to you, takes place in New York City, in Manhattan. And it wasn't that long ago, 50, 60 years ago or so, that people still used horses in parts of New York City. They had cars as well at the time, but some people still would use horses. And so this junk man is going to be using a horse, and he's going to act like he is, again, it says, some big time president, and his sorry ass horse, his secretary. That kind of, by the way, that description tells us something about our character, that she is going to be looking down on the junk man, right? She's being kind of sarcastic about this, the way she talks about him as being some big, he thinks he's some big president or something like that. And so that gives you a sense of her attitude. And that's the kind of thing that you can start to file away and think about how that helps us understand something about who she is as a character. One of the questions I've given you is to think about, all the questions I've given you relate to who she is as a character, and then how that relates to what happens at the end of the story. And so you'll have to be kind of piecing all this together, looking at all this information to see how all that relates to our understanding of how she reacts to what happens at the end of the story. So then she continues on. We kind of hated her, that is the lady who moved on our block with nappy hair and proper speech and no makeup. Says, and we kind of hated her too. Hated the way we did the winos who cluttered up our parks and pissed on our handball walls and stank up our hallways and stairs so you couldn't halfway play hide and seek without a goddamn gas mask. And so there's a lot of things going on in here. One of the things is we can understand that this is a city, and probably New York City because of that's one of the reasons why we might know it, because handball walls. Handball isn't played in a lot of different places. There's a few cities in the Northeast, but not very many. And so that's one thing. But we hated her the way we did the winos who cluttered up our parks. And so winos are going to be, we don't use that phrase anymore, but it's going to be kind of like homeless people or people who are men who usually might be drunk on the sidewalks. Those are winos. And so she says we hated the way that the winos who cluttered up our parks and pissed on our handball walls. So again, you can imagine these people that are going to be drinking and kind of hanging around the neighborhood, don't have other places to go to the bathroom, and how they're going to be in the parks and urinate on the handball walls, and as it says, stank up our hallways and stairs so you couldn't halfway play hide and seek without a goddamn gas mask. And that last part becomes really interesting because she's talking about playing hide and seek, which gives us a sense about how old she might be, right? How old might you be to play hide and seek? Probably not much more than 11, right? But notice the language that she uses here as well, goddamn gas mask. And so that might tell us something about her age, right? She's young enough to play hide and seek, but old enough that she's and has enough attitude that she's going to use this kind of language, that she's going to curse in the way that she does. And so again, what we're supposed to be doing is looking at all these little details and filing them away to start to kind of build up our understanding of who she is as a character. Then we go to the next sentence. Miss Moore was her name, the only woman on the block with no first name. And she was black as hell, right? We already talked about the fact that nappy hair says that she's black, but she was black as hell except for her feet, which were fish white and spooky. And she was always planning these boring ass things for us to do. Us being my cousin, mostly, who lived on the block because we all moved north at the same time and to the same apartment, then spread out gradual to breathe. And so we can see Miss Moore is the one who's going to be taking them on, as she says, these boring ass things to do. And again, that tells us something about the attitude that she has. She's young enough that she has to go do these things with this lady, Miss Moore. She's probably not a teenager that she would go do things on her own, but she's old enough and has enough of an attitude that she's going to say things like boring ass. And that's, again, telling us something about who she is as a person. She says about how they all moved north at the same time into the same apartment, then spread out gradual to breathe. We talked some before when we were looking at the piano lesson about the Great Migration, when African Americans came from the south to the north. And that's why there are so many black people in New York. They all came from the south, and this is a story of people who came from the south to the north. And you can see that they all moved to the same apartment, then spread out gradual to breathe, right? If they're all going to go to the same apartment at first, that tells you that they aren't necessarily very wealthy. They had to live in the same apartment. They started to get a little bit better when they started to spread out. But when it first started out, definitely they weren't making much money. And our parents would yank our heads into some kind of shape and crisp up our clothes so we'd be presentable for travel with Miss Moore, who always looked like she was going to church, though she never did, which is just one of the things grown-ups talked about when they talked behind her back like a dog. Again, kind of interesting that she didn't go to church, and the parents are going to talk about that church becomes rather important in the community, but everybody talks about Miss Moore because she doesn't go to church. But when she came calling with some sachet, a sachet is like a little bag filled with things that smell nice, like a potpourri or something like that. And when she came calling with some sachet she'd sewed up, or some gingerbread she'd made, or some book, why then they'd all be too embarrassed to turn her down, and we'd get handed over all spruced up. She'd been to college, and said it was only right that she should take responsibility for the young one's education, and she not even related by marriage or blood, right? So the idea that she had been to college becomes important, and it tells you, if nothing else, that for everybody else in the community, everybody else in her family, they haven't been to college, which again might explain something about their situation here. So again, all these little bits of information that we're picking up. So they said, so they'd go for it. Her parents would go for sending her off with Miss Moore, especially Aunt Gretchen. She was the main gopher in the family. If you got some old dumb shit foolishness you want someone to go for, you send for Aunt Gretchen. She's been screwed into the go-along for so long, it's a blood-deep natural thing with her, which is how she got saddled with me and Sugar and Junior in the first place, while our mothers were in a la-di-da apartment up the block having a good old time. And I think this is kind of important to understand something about how our narrator thinks about this Aunt Gretchen. She was the main gopher. That means she goes for it. She does whatever anybody else tells her to do. And we can think, is our narrator the kind of person who goes for what everybody else tells her or not? And she really looks down on Aunt Gretchen for this. She says, if you got some old dumb shit foolishness you want somebody to go for, you send for Aunt Gretchen, right? And that's, as it says, how Aunt Gretchen got saddled with. That's why she's stuck with me and Sugar and Junior, all the kids there in the first place, while our mothers were in a la-di-da apartment at the block having a good old time. So she's not living, she and Sugar and Junior are not living with their mothers, and the mothers are, as it says, are up in what seems to be a nicer apartment. And we can think about how she feels about that. So all of that begins to give you, I think, a sense of how we're potentially supposed to think about our narrator here. Her name is Sylvia, by the way. We don't know that yet, but we'll find that out later on. And then as you continue on reading through the story, start thinking about all the places where we are learning something about the kind of character she is, the kind of person she is. I say in the question, if she were your friend, how would you describe her to somebody else? And so be looking for examples from the text for that, and make sure that you're using specific quotes from the text that tell us something about who she is as a person. And then what's really important, make sure that you're thinking about how her character is important to the lesson that she is going to learn at the end. Would this lesson be as important to somebody who had a different character, who was different? So think about all that, and as always, let me know if you have any questions.